Welcome, Robbie.
Thank you. Welcome to
Thank,
you.
thank you so much for meeting with me and agreeing to talk about assessment this evening. I really, really appreciate that, and I think it will be helpful for the new clinicians and incoming school counselors. Do you mind sharing just a little bit about yourself? What is your role? What do you do um,
Yeah.
in the world?
So in the world, I do many things. Sorry. It's the evening time. It's been a day, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Um,
Relax.
yeah.
Take back.
I my day job is as a high school counselor, and I've been in that role for almost 10 years now. June will be 10 years. So we're
Wow.
getting really close to that mark there. And I've also served as a elementary and a middle school counselor for much shorter times, but have enjoyed doing that. And my night job is as a doctoral student in the counselor education program at Oregon State University.
Cool. Awesome. Shall we jump in?
Let's jump.
Okay. My first question is kind of more general, and I'm just trying to tease out some just like ideas. How do you understand the role of assessment in the counseling field? And maybe if you have some additional reflections about school counseling in particular, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah. So I think in the general counseling world, assessment is used all the time as people work through cases with clients and figure out the direction that they need to go or want to go. Those assessments may be formal, that could be informal, could be something that gets written down or something that's just done in the clinician's head. And I think that mirrors pretty closely with school counseling, although I think the assessment role for school counselors looks different depending on where you're at in the nation and the size of the school you're in. But most of the assessment work, I would say, is informal. Um, and so you might be interpreting formal assessments in meetings or helping students understand assessments that they have taken. Um, but for the most part, the tradition or the true school counselor role doesn't include a lot of, you know, intelligence testing or something like that.
Structured
Yeah.
stuff. Is there like a specific boundary for using assessments in a school setting for counselors?
I don't think that there's like a published boundary there. I think the scope of the work really kind of dictates that. And as school counselors, our work is all over the place. One minute you could be doing schedule planning with a student, and then the next minute you're doing crisis response counseling for a student who might be suicidal. And so in both of those settings, you're going to do some assessment, but it varies a little bit. And in the mental health scope of our work, we don't do a lot of long-term treatment planning or therapeutic work. And so um, our assessment in that world is generally limited to like screening or kind of figuring out where people are at. I guess that's the definition of screening, right? Um, and then connecting them to other resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this it seems like almost like because the job is so dynamic and you have to move through different roles and through different settings throughout the school, the assessment will be mostly informal because you don't have almost like time or space to conduct those larger inventories or statistical type measurements.
Right, right. And that's just not in line with the work that we do. I mean, most of our work is brief and um, I guess on the academic side of things, it is long term, but those kind of assessments, at least in my experience, have all been done by school psychologists, um, or in some cases, like special education teachers.
And you're talking about those more structured assessment
Yeah,
interventions.
yeah. Intelligence tests, achievement tests,
Mm-hmm.
you know, checklists for ADHD or um, autism spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Do you do like some of the career work or career counseling type work, or is that also like a different role within the school?
I think that's where the particular school that you're at can play a huge difference. You know, if you
Mhm.
think about a high school with one counselor and maybe limited other support staff, their role is going to be much broader than a school with four counselors. And so, in my own personal experience, I've been at the same high school for those 10 years, and we're a medium-sized school. We've got 3.5 counselors. We have two full-time people that work in our career center, and so a lot of the actual assessment work is conducted by those two other individuals that work in our career center. As counselors, we do a lot of work with the students after they've taken that and interpreting those results, using those results, and kind of making it meaningful to them on a personal level, but we're not necessarily administering that
Got it.
instrument. Yeah.
Thank you for clarification. I really appreciated this like entering thought of yours that assessment is conducted all the time, everywhere, and especially this informal way of conducting assessment in the counselor's head. And maybe in that context, could you talk a little bit about multicultural or diversity considerations that you kind of prepare yourself with as you're encountering a case?
Yeah,
Meaning, not a case, a student. I
sure.
mean, a student. I apologize.
No, I can go with case.
No, no,
Uh,
no, no, student. Let's not dehumanize children here.
the world will do that enough, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I think, and this is probably some of my own biggest areas of growth over the last 5 years, is really
Mhm.
learning and appreciating how much culture and diversity and um, all the different, you know, things that make up who we are as people can play a role in assessment. And so coming into that and in this lens of kind of constant assessment or continuous assessment, I think being really mindful to who the student is and where they've been in their life, what's happened to them, can really help you understand assessments better. So for example, if you have a student who, a teacher might be saying that they're constantly out of their class or out of their seat, and they're
Mhm.
really disruptive in the classroom, and they say, okay, well, today I did this observation checklist and they scored 14 out of 15 on this checklist. And that would be like a negative score. And so on the surface, you could say like, okay, well, that's a really bad score. I need to intervene there, in a certain way. If you step back and look at that student as an individual and you think about where they've been, perhaps they've had a really traumatic past, and the voice of that teacher really triggers them in that trauma. And so they're in a fight or flight state in that classroom and behaving in a way that doesn't fit like the mold of traditional classroom settings. So where that assessment says, this is not good, we need to do something about it, looking at it as a bigger picture, you might come up with the same interpretation of like, this is not good for the student and we need to do something about it for that student, not necessarily intervene upon the student.
Mhm. And you're talking about basically trauma, right? And something that may be disruptive in the classroom, and that can that's how it can be interpreted by the teachers. But it also makes a lot of sense when you're looking at those behaviors through the trauma informed or trauma focused lens. Are there so yes, of course, like the population afflicted by trauma is kind of needs those like cultural additional considerations. Are there any other folds that you are working of diversity that you're working on with daily?
Yeah, I think in our particular school, race is a big one. And it's big because it's not obvious. Um, the high school that I work in is majority white, with some, you know, 10 to 15% subgroups within that, or other minority groups. And so a lot of those students who would identify as something other than white kind of, if you're not paying attention to it, can culturally blend in because they've lived in that town their whole life. And so from like a base cultural sense,
Mm-hmm.
they identify in a similar way. Um, but when it comes to some other things, um, there's a huge difference. And you have to be really intentional about being aware of the impact of race on students, and especially with assessment. And then you taking that one step farther, there are cases where you really have to look at language, and not just the language that the student speaks, because a student may speak perfectly, you know, acceptable English to your ear, but their written or
Right.
receptive language in English may not be the case, may not be up to the point where they can understand an assessment, a formal assessment
Mm-hmm.
appropriately.
That's helpful. Yeah, it almost feels like we're kind of dipping into the ethical um, area. How do you conceptualize ethical consideration or dimension with in assessment in the school setting for counselors?
I don't think I have a really strong framework when that's assessment specific.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that always runs through my mind is do no harm. And that's one of the core ethical principles of our profession. And it's really easy in a school setting to do something that on the surface seems like it's good for the student, but in the end run you could cause some unintentional harm. And that can be particularly true with assessment. And what I'm thinking about there is when you have a student who's struggling academically and a teacher or a team brings them to your attention. And school counselors are one of the kind of point people for identifying students with learning disabilities, or that process. And so, a student may come to your attention, and if you're not thinking about the whole student, you could really easily over identify students as having learning disabilities, because you're not paying attention to certain things like culture, or
Mm-hmm.
language, or
Sure.
socioeconomic status, or school history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would say that's probably my overarching theme there. I'm sure in the ethical world there's a lot more that is not
Yeah.
immediately coming to my mind, but
Yeah, but what I'm taking from you is this continuous vigilance about those different factors and different, or just humanizing the student, right? Like looking at them as a multidimensional person, not just a label that
right,
could be. You're right. It could be easy to put those labels using assessment on students and then kind of determine the trajectory of their whole life.
right,
What will be considered by the next person who interacts with them and sees that on their file as attainable by the student or not, and that could potentially really not derail, but change that trajectory for sure. Um, I am curious um, about like I guess it's a magic, like a magic solution question. If you could change anything about using assessment in a school setting by school counselors, would there be something kind of that pops up right away?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind when you say that is easier access to more structured assessments.
Oh,
Um, there are times when, when you're working with a student where you'd like to get some of that information sooner or easier or quicker or, whatever you want to use there. And there are some barriers to that, being in a behemoth of a system, right?
mhm.
Like who's going to pay for that? If it's an
Yeah.
assessment that costs money, who's going to pay for that? Do the parents give permission to do that level of
Mhm.
assessment? Um, Maybe a sub part of that would be on the more informal side, having a better repertoire of assessments that school counselors can kind of fall back on that are informal in their delivery, but are verified and maybe valid um, instruments to begin with. And I'm thinking of like, suicide screeners or, depression screeners, things like that, that school counselors can kind of more quickly and readily pull up and
Mhm.
use, even if it's just in their head.
Oh yeah, for sure. Um, it does. I never thought about what do you have in your pocket like I do with lethality assessment or even like ACEs or assist that intermediate level of assessment that can be administered very
Mhm.
easily and very quickly that would give you a lot of information about potential presenting problem. I that's yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for
Yeah.
that. um okay, well, and the last question is kind of more of a wrap up, and um I am asking about what do you, from the position of the wisdom of spending 10 years in the school setting, which you have and you're an expert in, what would you like the master level clinicians who are just coming into this field to keep in the back of their minds about assessments as they're moving through school?
Yeah. I think I think it's probably going to relate to my magic solution in there's great value in the community that you build around you. And as you proceed through your master's program, there's information coming at you every day, and it's so hard to really soak up some of these things that will be really useful to you in your career. And so I would say continue to build that community of people that you can call on later and say, hey, like, I remember when we were in assessment class, we talked about this, and you really seem to have it down, or you might be working for an agency right now that has pretty clear protocols on that. How can you help me with this problem or this situation? Um, and so, you can't expect to learn everything in your master's program, but
Yeah.
you need to have those people, those mentors or peers or whatever that you can pull information from on different areas. And I think assessment is one of those areas that often gets overlooked in that kind of follow-up learning. Um,
Mhm.
but when you think about it from the broad sense, it's really important. And when you need it, you need it.
Mhm. Yeah. So consultation, networking, and keeping in touch.
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, Robbie, thank you so much for your time. I always enjoy and appreciate talking to you. So that was a treat.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was fun.
Okay.